Hello and welcome to the Positives of an Older Workforce. We're delighted today to have Stephen Anderson from the Age Diversity Forum and Hannah Thomas from Markle Law, who is an employment lawyer. Hannah's going to talk about menopause and Stephen's going to look at the whole issue of older people in the workforce and what the impacts are on them. I've got a stat that Devon County Council gave me, which is about 3% of those over 50 really took COVID and being at home as a change of life. And a lot of them have taken early retirement, which is really fascinating. So here we go, over to Stephen Anderson, and I hope you enjoy today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for that kind introduction, Sue. And thank you to the FSB for inviting me to talk on what I would say this, but it is such an important topic of the day in terms of the economy, whether that's local or global, and how diversity and inclusion can have a significant impact to business performance. The whole inclusion and diversity conversation goes beyond the moral compass of just being the right thing to do. It's actually become business imperative. Sue just mentioned a stat there about the effect of older people and the pandemic. There's wider ONS data that covers across the whole of the UK that talks about the adverse impact that the pandemic has had on the over 50s in the workplace. And by far, across most regions, the over 50s have been mostly affected in terms of becoming unemployed during that time. Certainly the highest percentage of people going onto welfare. And the problem that causes the businesses that they leave, and when we transition from the pandemic and those skills are needed, it's getting them back. But generally for older people, it's more difficult for them to return to the workplace. So what I'm going to talk about today is really why it's important to have this conversation about the age agenda, what it can help and improve, and what businesses can benefit from by having a diverse workforce, and some of the nuances and some of the specifics of what businesses can do and how they can benefit from that. I've got a small range of slides just to help the conversation along. I think if anyone has any questions, I think there's a chat box that can be used, and be happy to address these either at the end, or if no time at the end, post the event, and we'll certainly be able to reply to anyone with questions. So this first slide is really our heading slide for today, but in some ways it really exemplifies the opportunities of older people in the workplace and having multi-generational workplaces. This is a particular organisation, actually in Australia. It's a global issue. Talking about the data again, by I think it's 2040, 1 in 7 people in the world will be over 75 years of age. So that throws another challenge, but also opportunity of those individuals who have been in the workplace for a long time, that are still able to work, that still want to contribute, that can still add value to an organisation, that can pass on experience and skills. That's going to be really beneficial for organisations and help the economy overall. And this is a team that's working on site. Again, it's a common question that I'll probably come back to again later on in the discussion today. That as older people in certain industries, is it just certain industries that are affected by the challenge and opportunities within the workplace? And I think this slide says it all in terms of there's certainly no industry, no sector, no location that's immune to the challenge, but also has the absolute opportunity to benefit from an age diverse workforce. That includes holding on to that experience, those key skills that older workers can bring. And just a quick note, if I may, this is a picture taken from last year where they're celebrating Champion Age Diversity Day. Just as to put a note out there, June the 9th this year is Champion Age Diversity Day. So it's an opportunity for individuals, for organisations alike, to recognise age diversity in the workplace. So if, as a result of today, we've whetted your appetite in terms of the whole age agenda, perhaps that's something that you want to consider joining in. So if I may next move on to the next slide. So who are we talking about? I mean, I like to go back to sort of basics and fundamentals in this case. And in the workplace today, there's potential to have up to 5 generational groups. Some of these names that you will see listed here, you'll be familiar with. From the older worker perspective, we generally talk about the sort of the baby boomers, the over 50s. But as you can see, in terms of the profile of Generation X's, we're getting close to that generation group becoming the over 50s. And we do a lot of work on the multi-generational aspect, working on the younger end as well as, for supporting organisations and individuals back into work from an older perspective. But if we can get that education right as soon as possible and as young as possible, then we can seek to at least mitigate, if not eradicate, age bias and age discrimination in the workplace. So I just wanted to mention this because I'm sure there's these headings of generations you'll be familiar with, but it's really important to recognise the different generational groups. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the most adversely affected group in terms of unemployment from the pandemic has been the over 50s, yet they still have so much to contribute. There's so much to share and knowledge to disseminate between staff within an organisation. And I'm going to touch on a little bit about that again as we go through the slide. So next, if I may, I'm going to move on to the next one. So they're the people we're talking about. And so, why is it important? As it is, I'm picking up the first bullet point here. There's legislation in place that protects discrimination for age, because as it is for gender, disability, LGBT, it's as wrong, as unjust and illegal to discriminate for age. Unfortunately, when it comes to the workplace, age is one of that part of the inclusion agenda that is largely overlooked. And it's for many reasons, because there aren't that many legal cases brought, and there's no reference or precedent in place for that. It certainly doesn't get the promotional profile that some of the other inclusion agenda gets. If you just think about ethnicity and gender in recent times, gender now with really positive policy making progress being made, with the gender pay gap being a legal requirement now for businesses of a certain level to report on. And with incidents like George Floyd a year or so ago, just really brings to the fore key parts of the inclusion agenda that just help awareness and help the discussion. And I think it's good to have that discussion, good to have that challenge. As I've mentioned, it goes beyond doing the right thing. And if we just look to the right for a second here, you see this big arrow or sort of small house where we've housed some metrics, some data that confirm some positive outputs and outcomes for businesses if they take a consideration for diversity and the age inclusion agenda. So, and there's 6 headings there, whether it's collaborating within the team, so basically better morale within the team, retaining good skills, but the bottom four are really important, particularly as we transition from the pandemic now, in terms of productivity, business performance, market share in the markets we're in. But the market success, that's actually looking at new markets. So where you have a diverse workforce and you can look at, be seen to be reflecting your customer base better than maybe you have done, it gives you opportunity maybe to design new products, new services that are more accepted in a different marketplace. So if you have that diversity in approach to that design and innovation around your product, your service, then you're more likely to succeed when you bring that new product to market. So this is real data. This is actually working with one of our champion partners, EY. So this is one of the top, one of the big four, as they're called, consultancies, reporting on data from a whole wide range of industry sector on the benefits of going beyond the moral compass of doing the right thing for inclusion, but actually taking on board the values and the benefits that having that age diverse workforce can bring to your organisation, and some of the benefits that be gained in terms of internal staff, but also the impact that you can have on your markets. And it begins with leadership. So if you're a leader in your organisation, or you're owning your own organisation, and you're thinking about ways to develop or even survive, let's be frank and brutal about how the pandemic has left many industries. It's about surviving. And one of the big conversations that we're having with business and with our partners and with associated networks as organizations transition from the pandemic is those that are looking to not just survive but thrive are the organizations that have good purpose, good reputation, and at the core of that agenda can be inclusion. And many, if you're doing work with government contracts or any sort of bidding and tendering for work, to be able to demonstrate your capacity and your commitment to inclusive growth, which is another big part of the UK industrial strategy that goes into local industrial strategy, that actually has an advantageous effect on your bid, on your ability to win work. So there's real tangible commercial evidence and opportunity in applying consideration for age diversity. And if leaders have that mindset and that foresight, and ensure that is disseminated through an organisation and externally to supply chain, to third-party business partners, you end up getting better value for money in that regard. And certainly in terms of the partners that you work with, if you ask for those values that you commit to be extended to working partners, you start to get better value for the same money. Just a bit more wider, and I've sort of touched this already in terms of the data, the changing demographic of age has been described as a global megatrend. As I said, it's not just one region in the UK, it's the UK, but it's the world. The world is getting older, but it's also healthier. And with the different financial elements of the economy in terms of the impact on an individual's perspective, as well as wanting to work longer, people are having to work longer to pay their own way, with insecurities around pensions, that sort of thing. So this is another great opportunity for businesses when looking to bring new skills and experience into the workforce. There are people out there that have that capacity that potentially can add serious value to your organisation. So just to wrap up on here, in terms of there is more and more data and content providing the evidence to this. Many organisations through their own, big organisations through their own staff surveys, regional governments through their local community surveys, the age question and conversation is coming to the fore. It's time to really maximise the opportunities that that demographic can bring to the business environment. Just to one more thing about the whole where age sits as part of the inclusion agenda. As I say, age is already part of legislation from 2010 in terms of the Equal Opportunities Act. So it's down in law, and age is a great entry point to inclusion for all the other parts of the agenda as well, because it is the only part of the inclusion agenda that crosses every other one. Because whether you talk about disability or gender or LGBT or ethnicity, someone is of an age. So through the age lens, you can actually sort of consolidate your view of inclusion, which again just gives more terrible business expression in this environment. But it gives you economies of scale for inclusion through the age lens. Ness, sorry, if I can move on to the next one, please. Most isms are evidenced by stereotype, and I just wanted to mention this almost in bypassing, because I know we're struck for time a little bit today, but ageism is no different in that regard, in terms of assumptions or myths or perceptions of older people that are just simply not true, but they create obstacles, barriers to, certainly in the employment environment, for not just for people to return to work, but when they're in work, in terms of continued development, continued training, continued opportunity. You know, there's one of the myths that we seek to bust every day is that older people can't learn new things. Well, you know, guess what? You know, they can. It's just they need the opportunity. We do a lot of research within our organisation, and generally we see training beginning to wane when someone reaches their mid-30s, believe it or not. So it's up to organisations if they're going to commit to doing the best for their people and ensuring that their people can be the best they can be, is to keep the training and development going, because trust me, they can take and absorb lots of new things. That sort of goes hand with technology and older people don't mix. Another just complete falsehood. If you think about the organisations like Apple and Samsung, these organisations are nigh on 50 years old themselves. So many people in that baby boomer category that we looked at earlier have grown up with that technology, have grown up with not just today where you push a button on a bit of technology and it gives you a bad answer. These people understand why the answers may be bad, so can go and look for solutions and resolutions to problems. Another great asset to have, coming back to that diversity within an organisation in terms of development of new product, new skills. We work with many tech companies who really value some of those legacy technologies and legacy languages and systems that brought together with younger generations with new technologies, sharing and collaborating, come up with innovative new products and new design, because between them, they can formulate in new technology how systems can work and how they can be brought to market. So fantastic opportunities that completely bust these myths, along with things like older people take young people's jobs, complete falsehood. Older people are too expensive. Well, no, because again, as organisations and as we're talking, you know, the Federation of Small Businesses, I imagine many businesses out there are small business. There's various ways to employ, to interact, to bring these skills into the workplace, whether it's on a straight employment contract, whether it's on in a mentoring, coaching capacity, part-time. Many people who have been lost to the workplace just want to get back and contribute. Depending on that individual circumstance, they might just want to give back voluntarily. So we see a lot of people want to go back into the third sector, for example, to give back, to provide service and extend their skills from their career, but to access a smaller business market. Trust me, these people are really keen add value to the organisation, to help them to build. And if this is there's some work done by the International Longevity Centre on behalf of the UK government about 5 years ago about older workers. And they talked about a missing about 1.5 million people over 50 who have been lost to the workplace, but that weren't claiming wealth or anything like that. So they were invisible. But because of problems with bias and discrimination in recruitment practices, they couldn't find a way back to the workforce. And these people are desperate to contribute to bringing their skills and adding value to the organisation. So please look beyond these stereotypes and these myths. The age agenda, older people can really bring great value to the organisation. Next, if we can move forward, please. So I've talked about a few of these things already in terms of, just some of the direct values of an age diverse workforce and what, in particular, an older worker can bring to an organisation. They bring, depending on the position, and they can bring many facets and assets to an organisation. Yes, certainly their experience, but depending on the job profile, they can bring networks of connections, networks of more skills, more experience, networks of potential new business partners, networks of product development, networks of whether it's manufacturing, whether it's service delivery, so many more parts of the technical competence that you're getting as part of that older worker joining the workforce. They're bringing other assets with them. Building a healthy talent pool is really the opportunity to take on those skills experience. And then once you have them, make the best use of it in every which way, whether that's, let's say, direct technical competence, using the networks that they can bring. Many organizations talk to us about, when they're hiring, about people that they're looking for to have softer attributes, of how to work and collaborate with people, how to interact, how to face off to customers. Generally, that type of communication value can be found in the older demographic, just because of the way their careers have developed and the way that they've approached their careers earlier, and how they've translated that throughout the way their careers developed. Generally, you can find those softer attributes within older workers. So if you couple that with technical competence and an ability and willingness to learn, and then to collaborate and share and partner internally, you start to really get a fantastic pipeline of retained skills within the workforce. But as you then disseminate and showcase yourself as a considerate organisation externally, you then attract a whole different demographic, a whole range of skills that you might not otherwise see through, let's say, more traditional recruitment channels. So the second point, it just broadens the whole perspectives in terms of know-how, knowledge, good practice, good policy, good ethics, good ethos, all those soft values coupled with technical companies, driving innovation, as I said. Instill good practice that all the organisation buys into. And if you do that, you begin to generate a different sort of culture that becomes the norm. So everyone in the organisation feels the opportunity that they have individually, but also shared with the organisation. And that shared value and positivity, I'm sure many of you know, as business owners and working in business, will know that that can have a very positive impact to the outcomes and performance. I've talked about different ways of engaging, mentoring, coaching are ones that come up a lot. And that's not just, by the way, mentoring coaching in the traditional sense, which is generally the older person mentoring and coaching a young person. There can be a complete 180 there as well. So it's about getting a conversation going between the different generational groups, again, that we looked at earlier. I've already talked about the intersectionality and the whole multi-generational aspect. So I'll just skip over social value and responsibility. The whole, I think we've seen from the pandemic in terms of, I think we all found out both socially and in our family lives, as well as in the working environment, what's important. And again, I touched on this earlier about those organisations with good purpose, good reputation, are the ones that are going to do well as we transition. And the social value thing has another angle to it. There's the Social Value Act. I don't know if you know that, but a lot of that is to do about supply chain and looking more locally and regionally to ensure that you have the right tools, the right product, the right core materials available. And if you look more locally and responsibly, then generally you build up those local business networks that enable then you to expand and go beyond that. So social value in terms of, yes, doing the right thing, good purpose, good reputation, also extends again into the business environment through particularly procurement supply chain. So it can have a significant impact there. It does open a conversation, and we're going to be hearing from Hannah later about the menopause. We see that subject crop up in terms of, we get approached by organisations saying, oh, menopause is something going on in an organisation. Is that a gender thing? Is it an age thing? What box do we fit that in? And I think part of, as I mentioned earlier, through the age lens, you can broaden the perspective of inclusion and other conversations. It enables you to bring certain elements of other considerations like menopause, like mental health, work-life balance, getting that flexibility, opportunity to work flexibly and remotely. Again, a phenomenon of the pandemic was hybrid working. The opportunity and the essential requirement to work from home. That is one thing I think that's carried on since restrictions have been released. And the whole work-life balance, again, that was something that was only deemed for the older work, actually, that they wanted more flexibility about their work because maybe they needed it for healthcare reasons. Another myth, because there's data out there, again, that confirms actually young people are off work more than older people in terms of sickness. But work-life balance is something, again, I think as a value from the pandemic, we've all found a requirement, whatever our age. So through that age lens, it just gives you opportunity to bring that into conversation. And the whole well-being discussion that encompasses all of those things and many others. If someone is in work, being productive, contributing, is happy in the workplace, that then gives the opportunity to provide, to input back into the local economy. If they're well considered within the work environment, it's going to improve their well-being, no doubt. Ness, if we can move on to the next one, please. I'm not going to sit around here too much on this one, just to talk about, this really summarises some of the things we've already spoken about. But one of the key things on here is the last bullet point about fostering confidence and addressing adjustments. What that grand sentence actually means is, as well as being considerate for change, be open to challenge and to question. So within the workplace, be as a business owner, as a leader or manager within the business, be open to everyone who may have a particular question or a particular challenge about a particular thing. And this is all about an inclusion agenda, whether it's age or otherwise, just giving the opportunity for people to feel that they can contribute without fear, without, that they think, well, if I say something, I'm going to get, blackball, chastised for this. No, be very open. Again, this is part of developing that culture that improves internal work partnering, that builds to better business performance, extends to external work partnering. Next, if I can move on again, please. I think I've got 2 more to go. Just checking. Yeah. Influence and change. This is how organisations that take on the commitment and consideration for age diversity can have a broader impact. Again, it comes back to that, those organisations with purpose can really showcase themselves as a great place to work, a great business to work with, and therefore the outcomes of that is having, stronger loyalty in terms of the workplace, but also business performances. The power of that diversity, there's more data, there's more information being gained and garnered that organisations can have that evidence to learn from and can utilise. Some of the aspects around the discussion today, some of the specifics around recruitment and retention, just to touch on those again, the recruitment side of things. If you're struggling to find the right people, because that's generally what organisations want through, let's say, traditional recruitment routes, do think about looking at other channels, more maybe specific channels aimed at that particular demographic, which give you insight and access to a marketplace or people that you might not otherwise have seen. Now, it doesn't mean you have to solely go that route, but look to add that to your funnel of applications. And there's a number of organisations out there, like our own, that can offer that service and that functionality. But it's a very specific but very direct, can have a very direct impact to the business looking for those right skills, those right experiences that are maybe a bit broad as well. So you, as a small organisation, yes, we need people to generally we need people to maybe to cover more than one thing. So again, with an older worker's experience and view on what they've seen in the workplace, it can afford the organisation to maybe get more of that individual in terms of different roles and responsibilities within the organisation. So that's part of that power of diversity and inclusion. And as I mentioned, that can have positive knock-on economic effects in terms of doing business with external partners, whether that's through seeking more funding or bidding for contracts, government or otherwise. It does add value. I think most regional government tenders now ask for some sort of inclusion recognition. In the US labour laws, it's mandatory that anyone applying for work contracts has their consideration for age as well in that regard. So there's huge power in the use of diversity in developing business and developing growth. All of that creates awareness, which just helps the wider approach. And as individuals, as businesses, you can have a say in that as well, and feel good about that, but also highlight the fact that you're having that impact. Ultimately, it'd be great if this type of good practice and business performance translated into some sort of policymaker action, in which case that would again feed back into the business environment, whether that's through tax incentives or schemes to encourage all businesses to hire older people, which doesn't exist right now. By doing the right thing and getting the right business performance can have a subsequent knock-on effect in terms of other advantages that can be gained from policymaker situation as well. I'm going to move on to the last slide. I think it's the last slide, please, Ness. Yeah, I think this is the last slide. Yes. So what are we trying to achieve here? Everything I've been talking about in terms of culture, good practice, understanding why age diversity is important for the workplace, some of the specifics around recruitment, around skills development, how that impacts performance in business. If you recall some of those metrics we showed earlier, and I think it's been recorded, so you'll be able to revisit this as well afterwards. It's all about developing a happier, healthier workforce. If we have a happier, healthier workforce, it sounds a bit quiche, but it's true that business performance absolutely improves. You're going to have individuals that want to come to work, that want to do the best they can. And by the way, you're providing all the support and resources necessary to ensure that they be the best they can, because then your business will get the best out of it themselves as well. So it's creating that environment where whatever their age, let's put that out, but all staff are valued. And that's from the recruitment process perspective. So having a recruitment process that is open and considerate of all applicants, including older applicants, to when you recognise those values and benefits older workers could bring into the workforce, then continue that development of their skills, sharing between staff, building that culture where I think I mentioned earlier, where it becomes the norm, where people from different groups, whether that's age or other parts of the inclusion agenda, just naturally integrate, combine, innovate together, partner, come up with great ideas in terms of product, come up with new ways of doing things that save time and money. Second part is ensure those same opportunities continue for training and skill development. Whatever part of the career path those individuals are on. We touched on earlier about some of those myths and stereotypes that are just not true. So don't fall into that trap. Individuals can progress and develop. Older workers can certainly do that. All generations have something to contribute and something to share with each other. Encourage that. What comes from it? Creativity and innovation. These words I hear quite often reserved for the younger, more tech-minded type generations, but actually these words are absolutely applicable to all age groups, including older people, that can bring a whole level of creativity through softer skills, softer attributes, as well as their technical competence and how they've seen developed over time in particular industry sectors. Joining and partnering internally brings true innovation. I've touched on reflecting the customer base. The global population is getting older. Therefore, the population are going to want different things at different parts of their life. React, be proactive in terms of what your products and services are delivering, and ensure that you have that diversity within your workplace that can design the products and services and the opportunities to sell to widen existing markets, but also break into new markets. I've mentioned this brand reputation thing a lot. It really matters. It really matters right now. Everyone we're talking to is talking about the good purpose and reputation. And you know what? It's the right thing to, I said it's business imperative. It's also the right thing to do as well. And again, it's not just regional, national, it's global. Create that environment within, and Sue's going to tell me to shut up, so I'm going to say the very last thing: promote a positive, happy company culture and your business will succeed. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. And I mean, gone are the days that we used to look to the older people and they were the beacons, and that's what we want back, isn't it? Yeah, that was absolutely brilliant. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Right, I'm going to hand over to Hannah Thomas, who is going to look at the menopause for us. If things work out to plan, we're going to have 5 minutes for questions, which are just going to be absolutely brilliant. So over to you, Hannah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue, and fascinating, Steve. Obviously, very positive presentation, and I think it really fits in nicely with obviously my topic of discussion today. I'm going to look more specifically at the issue of menopause in the workplace. And this issue has very much been in the spotlight, and quite rightly so. We've had, for example, last year we had 2 parliamentary inquiries. We've had a lot of focus in the media around the menopause, and also in the context of the workplace, and that's what I'm going to talk about specifically this morning. What small business owners, employers can do in particular to support staff who may be impacted by symptoms of the menopause in the workplace. I just have a few slides. I just want to focus on some of those points this morning. So just to set the scene, I'm just going to move on to the next slide in terms of the specific demographics of the older workforce. Steve mentioned that over 50s unfortunately have the highest percentage of people going on to welfare and leaving the workplace. And what you really want to do as an employer is really to ensure that you hold on to the experience and skills of your older workforce, and you really, leaving aside what the law requires even for one moment, you really want to create an environment where staff feel valued and staff feel supported, and also staff can reach their full potential, and the business benefits are obvious of where that takes place. So just looking at the workplace demographics, so people over 50 now make up almost a third of the working age population, and that's up from a quarter 25 years ago. And we have ONS statistics that show that women aged 50 to 64 are the fastest growing economically active group. And now, given that the average age of a woman's menopause is 51 years, then inevitably a significant number of employed women will be working through their menopausal transition. And that's something for employers to be aware of where they employ that demographic. So moving on to further statistics, we have the British Menopause Society that has cited research, and this shows that up to a third of women will experience, unfortunately, severe menopausal symptoms that can impact their quality of life. But it's particularly in the work context that women report greater difficulty in managing their symptoms, and they can feel embarrassed, uncomfortable, and unable to disclose their menopausal status because they may fear that they're going to be stigmatized, or how is it going to be received? It's awkward, it's uncomfortable. In terms of the symptoms, I think there are up to 30 different reported symptoms of the menopause, but the most commonly reported difficulties menopausal women report in the workplace context includes having poor concentration, tiredness, poor memory. We hear a lot about brain fog, and this is also a symptom that's been in the spotlight around being a symptom of long COVID, and also feeling low or feeling depressed, and also lowered confidence. So it's really looking around what employers can do to support women who are experiencing that in the workplace context. Now, the most recent research has been by the Fawcett Society, and that's research from April this year. And as far as I know, this is the largest representative survey of menopausal women conducted in the UK. Among key findings of this survey are that 1 in 10 women have worked during the menopause, have unfortunately left their job due to their symptoms, and 80% of women surveyed say their employer hasn't shared information with them or trained staff or put in place a menopause absence policy. I know some of you may have seen Davina McCall's documentary. This focused on some of the research that I've cited from the Fawcett Society around women's experience in a workplace context too. So just moving on to the next slide, looking at what are the employer's duties. So in law, what are employers supposed to be doing, or what what must they be doing? And I know Steve mentioned what box does the menopause fit in? And obviously we're looking this morning through the prism of age, but there are other legal considerations too, of course. Employers are responsible for the health, safety and well-being of all their staff. and they mustn't unlawfully discriminate under the Equality Act 2010. And Steve very nicely talked a lot around the non-legal considerations too, of course, and we've got obviously where staff are supported, we have a better work culture, we have improved staff retention, reduced absence in the workplace. Absences from work are obviously one of the key issues that we are contacted by members on the FSB legal advice line. I think it can be quite difficult to manage those absences, of course, particularly for small businesses, and better performance. And there's also less risk of poor employee relations and, of course, poor employer reputation. So just looking in a little bit more detail in terms of my next slide around the legal workplace protections for women who experience menopause and this impacts them in the workplace. So there isn't a specific law that protects employees just purely on the basis that they are menopausal and struggling in the workplace for this reason. Now, this is unlike, for example, being pregnant or being on maternity leave, because there are specific protections there in law for those women. So we're really looking at, I've talked a bit about the employer's duty of care under health and safety legislation. So that's namely the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. And there are various regulations that have been made under this primary act. So in terms of health and safety and the duty of care towards staff's health, safety and welfare at work, from the perspective of someone who has experienced menopausal symptoms that may impact them at work, we're looking at the ability to control the temperature and ventilation in the workplace. So that could include, for example, providing desk fans, or perhaps thinking about where somebody is sitting, have they got the ability to sit perhaps next to a window seat, and also uniforms, whether the material or cut of the uniform might exacerbate someone's symptoms where they're going through the perimenopause or the menopause. Also, where this is practical, and it's not always practical, if there is somewhere suitable for the worker to rest, if they need to do so, having toilet and washroom facilities which are easily available, and also having cold drinking water available in the workplace. So I'll just look a little bit more around discrimination under the Equality Act. So the Equality Act protects what are called 9 protected characteristics. So where does the menopause fit into these protected characteristics? So usually the protected characteristics that are relevant here are going to be someone's sex, they're female, and in a small minority of cases, the symptoms of the menopause may be so severe that they are a disability under the Equality Act. I'll come on to that. And also age, of course, because the average age of menopause being 51, we're looking at workers who are, in the main, female workers who are over 50. So sex discrimination, harassment. So this could be, for example, where the employer treats a woman's menopause or perimenopause symptoms less seriously than it would a male worker's health conditions when they're considering drop in job performance or disciplinary action due to sickness absence. We have had a small amount of case law in regards to age discrimination, disability discrimination. One particular case, a very sad case, where one woman experienced unwanted comments and banter regarding their menopause, and the tribunal did find that amounted to harassment based on sex. Age discrimination goes without saying, so unfair treatment of workers because they're going through their menopause, considering the age group that they would fall in, it could amount to age discrimination, or it could be a combination of these 3 protected characteristics. We've seen that in tribunal cases. So just moving on to the next slide. Disability discrimination. So essentially, and in short, if someone has a long-term substantial impairment that affects their normal day-to-day life, and it's long-term, meaning it's lasted 12 months or it's likely to last at least 12 months, then that will amount to a disability under Section 6 of the Equality Act. So it's not difficult to see how severe menopausal symptoms could amount to a disability, and we have seen the tribunal's readiness to recognise this increasingly so. We have one tribunal case from 2020 where the employee started a new job She was having difficulty concentrating due to the noisy environment. She was distracted by conversations in the workplace, had hot flushes up to 12 per day. And her experience was that using the computer was slower for her because of her difficulty in concentrating, and also in recollecting how to use certain software packages because of anxiety. Her ability to read and write even at a reasonable pace was also affected by those symptoms. And she also talked a little bit earlier around brain fog, difficulty recollecting and remembering information. She found difficulties remembering previously simple things such as even her car registration plate. So you can see here obviously a range of symptoms, and you can see here obviously the tribunal's willingness to recognise that these symptoms could amount to a disability in more severe cases. So this really brings me on to, and I know Steve mentioned this, around just trying to create an environment where all your staff feel valued and supported. So in brief, what can managers do to support employees? I would say as a starting point, and particularly for small business owners, there isn't a statutory requirement to have a specific policy around the menopause, and it's not always, the key is not always having long, complicated written policies, but it's really about your staff knowing that they can raise issues that affect their work without fear of repercussion, and knowing that they will be supported. And even if the manager wouldn't have experience themselves, they can signpost the employee to sources of help. If you don't have a specific policy around the menopause, you may have existing policies which deal with issues that arise from the menopause. For example, your sickness absence policies, ill health capability policies, wellbeing policies, and so forth. And just to mention, as with any health or wellbeing issues that impact staff, making staff aware of a point of contact. It could be their line manager, it could be someone else, another manager in the workplace that they can go to if they do have a health or wellbeing issue that's impacting them in the workplace. I think this is really the key in terms of what employers can do to help mitigate adverse effects of the menopause. And it really goes without saying that the conversations should be treated sensitively, and it's absolutely fine if the manager cannot give an answer at that very moment in terms of what support they can provide, to make a note, to treat it seriously, and then to obviously respond to the employee in terms of what support can or cannot be provided in terms of the particular issues that the employee has raised. Confidentiality is always key, and also if an employee is divulging health information, then there are certain data protection principles that the employer must always comply with. So at the FSB, so obviously what can we do to support members, to assist members with issues around age and the menopause? So just to flag up, we have the FSB Legal Hub, of course, and there are a large number of policies, and we also do have a template menopause policy together with some separate guidance notes to that policy. And the FSB template policy, it sets out the support that employees who are experiencing menopause symptoms can expect to receive in the workplace. And it refers to any existing policies, and it signposts staff to sources of external advice by third parties and training that they can access on the menopause. We do, of course, have our very busy FSB employment legal advice line. So our employment solicitors can assist members with particular inquiries that arise or particular difficult cases. And just also to mention FSB Care. So this provides support for members in terms of their own individual experiences in terms of physical and mental health conditions. And there are a team of experienced nurses at FSB Care that can assist with those. So I think that just really, so anyway, I just want to say thank you for listening, and I hope you found that helpful. So I think just wanted to give an overview or a brief overview in terms of looking particularly at issues around the menopause and the workplace. So I'll hand back to Sue.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Hannah. It falls into a lot of little categories, doesn't it? It's quite, yeah, absolutely fabulous. Okay, we have got time for some Q&As, and I think we've got 3, so let's grab my glasses. I've got Lisa talking about I work for home instead, who offer support to people to live independently at home. Our eldest care professional has been 83 years old, and many of our care professionals are older people. They are invaluable and have so many skills and experience. There isn't really a question there, but if anybody wants to pick that up, that'll be brilliant.
Yeah, just to reflect about those use of soft skills in certain industry sectors. I mean, the whole care sector deserves a complete re-evaluation anyway in terms of the value that they bring to everyone's lives. So I can't say enough about the positive things about that. But it's one example where older people can bring a whole depth of knowledge, but also experience to certainly sensitive situations in the work, when at work, but also helping potentially younger people to come into that profession as well.
Yeah, I answered a previous question, and Anthony's answering it as well. Age Diversity Day is the 9th of June, so
yes,
for everybody, we'll celebrate on the 9th of June. Joanne's asking, so many people have vast experience to share, however they want more inflexible work. How can companies make it easier for themselves to tap into this market without forcing people to work in traditional ways?
Yeah, no, thank you, Joan. I actually saw your question. I thought it was a really interesting question. It was a really key question as we obviously coming out of the pandemic. And we have seen on the legal advice line as well, more employees are really wanting to work flexibly and to have that opportunity to do. So what can employers do to help facilitate that? I think there are a number of ways. I mean, there is the law, and obviously there's a statutory right for someone to request, and that's simply to put in a request to work flexibly, and the employer who receives that request has to consider it reasonably, and they can reject it for only one of these specified statutory reasons in law. But if we're talking about, and I think this is the focus, if we're talking about how we're going to encourage perhaps a more diverse workforce, including those who want to work flexibly, it is a good idea to think about how your recruitment and how you actually advertise that position. Can the role potentially be done flexibly? I think it's really good to set it out at the offset, and obviously that may mean you can potentially cast your net wider in terms of having a more diverse workforce, including people who have caring responsibilities, older people, people who are disabled, obviously being encouraged to apply for the position if they want to work flexibly. So I think that's a really good question.
Yeah, just to add, if I may, that what Hannah just touched on there is another fantastic opportunity for businesses. I touched on it briefly in terms of the whole hybrid working phenomenon that's come out of the pandemic. Depending on the role, and assuming it can be done flexibly and remotely, the scope in terms of the reach, as Hannah was just talking about, is just so much more far and wide that you can have people working remotely in a completely different location. And potentially that could give you an insight into a different, more local market elsewhere as well. So as well as getting the best person for the role that you're looking for, it gives you other add-on advantages as well. So yeah, I think I think this is one work practice that I think is here to stay. And Hannah just mentioned the law. We're seeing a lot of organisations who advertise their jobs to us, looking to reach those older workers, actually putting that in their job descriptions now, that remote working is a possibility and potential, just to look to attract a wider application set.
Excellent, thank you. And you know what, you've done it perfect to time as well, because the last question is a thank you. So can I just say that was absolutely brilliant. So thank you ever so much, both of you. I really enjoyed that session. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening. I'll see you all soon.